Afternoon, everyone, and welcome from a getting warmer Johannesburg, and we welcome everyone who's joining us from Joburg, Pretoria, Centurion, from all over. Welcome to everyone. We are going to have a great session this afternoon. We are going to open the session for this month's Ask the Experts. As you know, since you registered, the topic is director misconduct. And we will be having this session specifically to discuss matters pertaining to both director misconduct, and more specifically, how to deal with our directors who do not fulfill their duties in terms of the law and or who do not adhere to the standard of conduct expected of a director. We've got, I know our advertisement advertised the three-person panel. The CIPC was going to join us, but unfortunately they have not been able to join us this afternoon. It was a last-minute emergency that has prevented them from joining us. But we do have two really experienced and informed panelists, both, I'll introduce them in a second, to carry us through the afternoon, and I'm going to welcome them in a second. Would Advocate Faye Mukaddam and Advocate Stefanie Fick please turn on your cameras and your sound, and then we can say hello to our audience. Just a few basic housekeeping rules for this afternoon, if you don't mind. I'm going to ask everyone who wants to ask a question to please pop your question into the Q&A session, the Q&A box you'll see on your screen. That way we can control the questions that come in and out and we don't get lost in the chat. And then we're going to go to our very important chat function. With our chat function, I'd like to just do a few ground rules. Often we see a little bit of a side discussion going on, which we both welcome and encourage. It's good to see engagement from our other members, but I'm going to ask you that this could possibly be quite a hot topic and with differing views, and I'm asking you to keep all comments and discussions quite constructive. Keep it, make sure it's not personal when you reply to somebody with a comment you don't agree. And this is an apolitical platform. So we're going to keep it very much about the topic, constructive and helpful comments. Now, as stage 6 load shedding kicks in at 4 o'clock, I'm thankful for those who have been able to join us and those who can stay on the line. It is a distressing situation for us in this country, but I would like you for the next 2 hours to maybe kick off your shoes, sit back with your hot coffee if you've had electricity to make a hot coffee, and if not, please pour yourself a glass of wine or whatever you would like to do to relax and enjoy this session. I'm now going to kick off with our two very informed panelists, and I welcome them. I'm going to start with Advocate Faye Mukaddam, no stranger to our IoDSA sessions. Faye is all about upholding law and governance and championing human rights and social development. She's a commercial lawyer and advocate of the High Court of South Africa, a chartered director of South Africa, one of our designations at the IoDSA, and a specialist board and transaction advisor. Stefanie Fick is the executive director of the Accountability Division at OUTA, the organization undoing tax abuse. Prior to that, she was also a senior state advocate for the prosecution of serious commercial crimes, and before that, just a state prosecutor. I don't mean not just a state prosecutor, but a state. You will recognize the name OUTA. In March 2017, OUTA and the South African Airways Pilot Association brought an application to the Pretoria High Court for an order declaring Dudu Moyeni a delinquent director, based on her conduct and her action during her 5-year term as a chairperson of the SAA board. And in 2020, the Pretoria High Court Judge Ronald Tane declared Moyeni a delinquent director and banned her from holding a directorship position for life. So the work of OUTA is extremely important, and we hope to hear more about this from Stefanie as we go through the afternoon. I would like to kick off with Faye, if you don't mind, Faye. I'm going to start with you. And I'd like to know if you could just give us a basic outline of the legal and governance aspects around director misconduct, if you don't mind, just setting that scene first.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you, Julie. And I know you're very excited that all our lights are up. So We're very happy to be able to make you happy this afternoon, and to everybody who's participating and who's joined us today. This is quite a provocative and a controversial topic, given where we currently are, and I'm so thrilled to be sharing the panel with Stefanie. But just for some context setting, I think that the one thing which anybody who knows me, and I've seen so many very dear friends and colleagues in the participant list, so I'm thrilled that they're here, and I do know that they have very sobering opinions on this matter, so I'd love to hear from them later. But the drum that I've always been banging ever since I've been involved with the IoDSA and the director of companies has been that board members don't read enough, and directors don't read enough, and leaders don't read enough. So the questions that will come up later on in the session, and I'm sure that we will discuss, is, you know, do we have the framework and the means with which to hold directors accountable? And I want to say a resounding yes. It might not be perfect, certainly not, and we have a room to go. But if you look at the legislative and regulatory framework that is currently in place, we actually are very fortunate when it comes to global standards that we do have that yardstick and those guidelines. So first off, just to set the context for you and the listeners, Julie, would be that we're talking about director misconduct within the context and against the backdrop of the Companies Act. We still call it the New Companies Act. It's a 2008 piece of legislation, but as Stefanie knows, we always use that against the 73 piece of legislation. Coupled with that, from a legislative perspective, you've got the Public Finance Management Act and the Municipal Finance Management Act, and all those pieces of legislation which have come post the 1994 constitutional democracy, and that basket of legislation is written using very similar verbiage, and it's very anchored within the constitutional Bill of Rights type of thinking that underpins our constitutional democracy. Obviously, and I know we're going to get a lot of, I'm sure, exciting discussion when we talk to Stefanie. You've got to look at the enabling legislation, which has actually birthed or founded certain institutions, and there you're largely looking at public sector or state-owned companies, state-owned enterprises, etc. And that legislation has to be again read in conjunction with the Companies Act and the PFMA, etc. Then, of course, I think it was a 2008, or I can never remember the date, a cabinet decree or discussion at cabinet level, which was that King 4, or at the time it was King 2, I think, and we were sliding into King 3, has been elevated to a standard, an internationally benchmarked best practice standard, which is to be read together with Companies Act, with the PFMA, MFMA, as well as any of the enabling legislation. Obviously, for this context, we must be aware of whichever entity we are looking at, whether it's public, private sector, non-profit, you know, even a ratepayers association or a school governing body. You need to look at the policies and procedures that are relevant to the organization. You need to look at the governing body or the overarching governance structure in terms of what their code of conduct and their charter says. And then, of course, given that I am fundamentally a commercial lawyer, I believe that the law of contract is paramount to all things. And so the contract by which a director is appointed to that board, even if you might not have a pure agreement or a comprehensive agreement, but an appointment letter, and there is common law that guides us in this regard, that's also really important. So for me, that's the starting point. And if you want to play in this space, you need to know what the rules of engagement are. And also, we'll talk more about in detail the sections specifically that I'd like to tease out with the Companies Act, but how that guides the poor performance of a director versus a breach of fiduciary duty. And all that falls under the umbrella of director misconduct. So those are just my kind of introductory thoughts, Julie.
Thanks, Faye, much appreciated. Stefanie, can I ask you to also sort of set the scene from an OUTA perspective on what OUTA does in this space and how they address director misconduct.
So the organization Undoing Tax Abuse, our mandate, we started off with tolls, and glad to say that hopefully government will realize that irrational policy with a 50% compliance rate is really dead in the water. But be that as it may, we expanded our mandate to look at challenge corruption and maladministration in all levels of government. So to bring that back to director misconduct is, the misconduct that we saw with, I think the most recent example is state capture in our state-owned entities. So what happened with the Dudu Mnyeni, and we'll probably go into more detail with Dudu Mnyeni, but it was a classic example of a non-executive chairperson of an SOE that was behaving badly and nothing was being done. And this is civil society's role. Where do we sit? What is our role that we can play? And I'm glad to say that, with support, that we could say that as civil society, there's a responsibility also on us to keep people, hold people to account, and using existing legislation in order to accomplish that. I agree with Faye that, our laws may not be perfect, but I think we are in a fortunate position that we have a constitution. I like to say a beautiful constitution. People fought hard for a democratic country, and that what we have seen in our history is that sometimes it's people. It's not the legislation, it's the people. So what we try to do is to hold to account. Where government fails it is then the duty of civil society to come together and hold to account. And we were fortunate enough to use, for example, the Companies Act, use the delinquency to hold to account the former chairperson of SAA, Dudu Mnyeni, and declare her delinquent director. But I think that, looking at where we are, political interference is always a big thing. So except for accountability, I think what was important, and this was also in the Zondo report, is reform. So how do we can analyze what went wrong, but how do we reform? How do we make sure it never happens again? So OUTA also takes that very seriously. It's to, be reactive and put pressure, sometimes also not taking the actions ourselves, but put pressure on, for example, SAICA and so forth to act against their members. And other directors to take actions against their directors. But obviously we are more focused on our state-owned entities because we've seen what happened in our state-owned entities. If directors, executive and non-executive directors, do not take their position seriously. And that flows to, but we need the right people in the right positions to make sure that the responsibility that is on their shoulders is carried out. I think, and this is my personal view, that and I think it's shared even in your paper, that I think there's an added responsibility when it comes to SOEs, because they, you talk about shareholders, the minister is the shareholder, but ultimately the shareholder in all SOEs is each and every one of us. On all levels of society, is that any SOE, any state department is acting on our behalf. We tend to say taxpayers' money, but taxpayers' money, although we are, if you look at taxpayers, I think there's 12 million odd people registered for tax, but only 6 million people pay. But that has got a direct impact on each and every person, whether you're a taxpayer or not. If our SOEs are not managed properly, if the governance on the board levels aren't there, it has an impact on each and every one. And we're seeing that now. all the positives and negatives from the Zondo report, I think the only thing that is missing is, do we really understand the impact of corruption? Do we really understand the impact if a director, whoever you are, do not consider your position as important, and that you have a duty and on an SOE board, not just to the board members, but to each and every South African. So as OUTA, we try and hold to account, but we've also realized that we need to also assist in order to get SOEs right back to where they should be, because guys, load shedding is a reality because of a very big SOE that was mismanaged. And we're feeling that now, but we need to reform, and we need to get back on track. So that is just in a nutshell. I can honestly hawk this session for the rest of the day of what we should what we should all take hands and do, but yeah, that's in a nutshell.
Well, we're going to ask you some pearls of wisdom on that one in a second, but I just want to go back to Faye. The foundation that you sent is all good and sound in theory, but how does it play out in practice in the boardroom?
So, Julie, I think that's an excellent question, first of all, because, and maybe that's the joy of having Stefanie and I here. So it's that bridge between theory and practice, because it all sounds good, but, and you well know that the IoDSA has been doing board evaluations and board appraisals for many, many, many years. And the trends and the data that we have gotten out of those as we've mapped through the decades essentially shows a few things. One, that obviously, I shouldn't say obviously because it still remains shocking, that board members are not come in and are appointed but don't understand the rules of engagement. Horrifyingly, and to Stefanie's point in SOEs, they haven't read the PFMA, the MFMA, or the enabling legislation, and read it in a way that is clearly understood. And read it in detail and understand that. So I've always said that's like getting behind the wheel of a car without having your driver's license. Don't understand and know King in detail. And, you know, it throws the induction and the continuing professional development programs into question as well. And we'll talk about that a bit later. But to get back is this idea of misconduct first. And we need to start at the foundational perspective before we talk about the house that governance built. And that director misconduct falls into two categories, and it is quite clear in the Companies Act. So there shouldn't be a need or a suggestion of, oh my gosh, we never know how we're going to do this. How do we hold the people accountable? Go to source. It talks about the poor performance of directors on the one hand, and then this breach of fiduciary duty on the other hand, which is gross negligence. And to tie it all together and link to between Stefanie and I, the matter between OUTA and Ms. Mayeni is indicative or exemplary of the director misconduct in terms of the breaching of fiduciary duties specifically. Now, further, the Companies Act, and I talk about the Companies Act, but for SOEs, there's a very similar reflective clauses in that legislation as well, that talks about director conduct and the standards. So you're talking about I think it's section 69 going through to 71, section 75, 76, and 77. And the reason I'm noting these down is because when people ask what are the outputs of this, go and read those first before we attack the legislation. And that specifically sets out some of the examples of director misconduct clearly. And it also reminds us as leaders in these different entities that we can attract either civil or criminal liability if we do not do our jobs properly, if we do not deliver on our mandate in terms of fulfilling our fiduciary duty, which is specifically why we've been appointed. Specifically, section 75 talks about your conflict of interests and your declaration of interest. And the reason that I start there is because practically you look at that as a source, and then you look at the numerous governance tools and governance protocols that are available to us which allow us to implement the law. So the law says, this is what you must do. And the governance tools, and it's all there in King, it's there in many of the IoDSA papers, and I don't know how best, I'll talk to some of them later, the practice notes, the guidance papers that tell you, okay, then how do you do things? So if I just put out section 75, which I know OUTA leveraged quite a lot in their matter against Ms. Myeni, this protocol of having a declaration and conflict of interest policy. And in the policy, which is for every board to put out there and ensure is in an organization, for it to be there, put out, discussed, approved, and then to be cascaded into the organization so that everybody knows where they stand. But the policy might be a protocol, but the actual tool that comes out from there is your global declaration of interest. And that's why we shouldn't focus on conflicts of interest. We should focus on what your declaration of interest is. And that declaration of interest talks to anything that you have an interest in that could unduly influence or affect or hamper your independent judgment, your application of an independent, and we talk about it in legal speak, an unfettered mind. And so once you then give people the tools, so it's this global declaration of interest, which should happen, I suppose, at the beginning of your tenure. You might want to have a watered down version at the beginning of the calendar or annual financial year. You then, of course, can have a quarterly update, simply because as South Africans, we are an entrepreneurial nation, and from quarter to quarter, you might get involved in other businesses. And then, of course, you've got your typical one, which is for the agendas of the board meeting, which I know I've chaired a disciplinary panel for one of our regulatory authorities, Stefanie, and you'd be surprised how glibly those things were handled. And it came through in the minutes. It actually was quite handled in quite almost a malicious compliance manner, even though nobody intended to be malicious about it. So people don't take these tools seriously. The test that we are required to adhere to, Julie, is the best interests of the entity, to fulfill our fiduciary duties, to act with the duty of care, skill, diligence, for common and proper purpose. Every single one of these, and we can talk about practical implementation in a lot more detail when it comes to the takeaways as well. Every single one of these elements has a practical governance tool that can be introduced. So it's not dependent on my discretion or the fact that I might know this and my fellow board member might not know it enough. It is clear from the outset that before you are appointed, these things should be communicated to new directors coming in, and of course to keep directors continuously abreast and refreshed on what is happening out there. So we do not work in a vacuum, and we must be very clear that as a peer group, and for the 150 odd people on the session today, that we hold one another accountable, because that talks to the point that Stefanie raised around civil society and what it is that we can do. And I can't remember, somebody made a comment about society is what it accepts. Well, we're saying we're not accepting any of this lowballing and this immoral and unethical and unlawful conduct any longer. Thanks, Julie, back to you.
Thanks, Faye. I must admit I've been following with interest the comments on the side here. Just for those who are struggling with connectivity, thanks to an SOE, please note that we are recording this session and we will be circulating it to all those who registered for the event and who've logged on. Also following some of these comments within the comment section, I wanted to ask Stefanie, I'm just going to go back and ask you, after I've seen some of these discussions, what role should civil society play? What should civil society's role be when we talk about holding directors for SOEs to account? And I just wanted to say, I think this also links in with one of the questions that we have that's come through about ethics and culture of good governance. What more is needed to embed these other than the law? And I think that is connected with accountability. So I'm going to ask you if you would like to answer my question as well as the second question that came through. Thanks, Stefanie.
Just remind me if I forget halfway through that I answer all of it. I don't think it's in essence civil society's responsibility to keep the SOEs in check. I think that there's a minister and executive who they report to, which is part of the problem. But when government fails, when your board of directors fails, I think what we've learned, and it was an expensive lesson, is that we as civil society do not just have to accept. I think we are there to mobilize and to expose if something is wrong, to expose a director like with Dudu Mnyeni, that we don't have to accept that. We don't have to accept that someone is ruining an SOE, is making sure that an SOE goes down the tube, a very important SOE, an SOE that today is struggling, that was placed under business rescue, that was bailed out with whose money? Money that we could have used for so many other things. So I think that for us, it is about, standing up and making our voices heard when necessary. But also, it's not just a challenging position. I think we've also found that, civil society and business is there to assist. I think what we've learned is that if we take hands, we are a force to be reckoned with. That sometimes government doesn't listen and we need to challenge. But if we take hands, government, civil society, business, that we can be a force to be reckoned with. So I think what we've learned is that, sometimes it is our duty to stand up and say, we are not happy with what is happening and using the tools, you see, and that's why I think, you can hear the passion in Faye's voice. And I can talk for hours about our legislation, that we really have a constitution that is supposed to protect civil society and that we can use the tools and sometimes thinking outside the box in order to use the tools to hold people to account. But civil society really needs to understand that I think ultimately the power should be with us, because government, politicians, parliament is supposed to guide us and do business in our best interest, not in their own best interest. I think we've lost our path along the way. It is less about what is in the best interest of everybody. It's a bit about resources, who has access to resources, and how can we use the resources for our own benefit and not for the benefit of everybody. I do sound like a broken record, but I hope my hope is that people understand that if we curb corruption, we can do so much more. And corruption in SOEs, because that's where the money is. PRASA, someone mentioned PRASA. That has a direct bearing on people do not have access to cars. People, we're complaining about the petrol price, but there's people that is highly dependent on whether a train is running or not. And if that SOE can't supply that, we don't have it. Every time I just think about kids that needs to go to a school that is falling apart, that is probably walking huge distances to go to a school that is falling apart. Why? Because there's no money to give them proper education, give them proper public transport in order to go to school. Why? Because in our fiscus, we had to bail out an SOE. Doing media interviews when we were busy with a delinquent director, I sometimes think that people, it's SAA. I am struggling to get food on my table. Why would I care about SAA? You should, because all the money that goes to SAA, because it's mismanaged, is less money we can spend on a health system that is working. Everybody that's sitting in a queue at a hospital to wait for an injection and all of that is because somewhere along the line, money was misspent. And we can't spend the money on the social needs. And we have an unemployment rate of close to, that's probably, but we are creeping towards 50%. And that has such a big impact disagree with me, but I think people generally just they don't want to be dependent on the state for a grant. They want to go out, work, and then support their families. But, why is that so important? It all goes back to the management of our SOEs, management, the directors of the boards. Now, it is a problem. I think that there are good directors out there. There are people, there's whistleblowers out there. In our instance, she wasn't a board member necessarily, but Cynthia Stimple and Tuli Mshe that put their lives on the line. In fact, whistleblowers are pushed to the side and they can't find jobs because they had the moral courage to say, know what? No. And we need to change that around as well. Is that if as a board member you are, you are victimized because you want to do the right thing, let's rather support them. Let's turn it on its head that if you are corrupt, you the outsider, and that whistleblowers in a board setting, wherever, management, wherever, that you are supported and that you are not the odd one out. But coming back to good governance, I think it's got a lot to do with, again, political interference, that at the end of the day, it is the minister that decides who is on board, and that it is open for abuse, that you put the right people in there, not necessarily with the right experience. I also do think it is about education. I think there's opportunity for the younger generation to become members of boards, take their position seriously, and being mentored by, the older generation. Good governance, I think, is not just a tick box exercise. It's being proud, and I can't talk about business, because business to me, and please excuse me, please don't crucify me, it's more about money. But in SOEs, it's really about, looking after South Africans' money and making sure that the SOEs are managed to everyone's benefit, not just a few. But it is it should be proudly South African. You should be proud to be on the boards. And yes, you need to be remunerated, but it's not about, getting an enormous amount of money. It's about being proud to be part of the system. And I sometimes think, because if you are an executive, I think it's sometimes easier, because then it's about there's labor laws, but when it comes to non-execs, if board rules, board charters, and maybe contracts with board members aren't in place, I think it is open to it's open for abuse. Because how do you compare yourself? Where do you draw the line? And if you have people on boards that are not willing to take action, are not willing to hold to account, you can have a whole board that is just missing all the signs. Because how did we get to Eskom that was basically run, according to Judge Zondo, by Guptas? How on earth did that happen? How did it happen that PRASA is in such a mess? You can list the SOEs, and I think we need to create a culture where it is, you are proud to serve on a board, and you do this. It's not for the self. It's more for everybody else. So sorry, Julie, you'll have to help me. Did I answer all the questions?
Yeah, perfectly. I'm going to come back to Faye, and this is going to touch on more or less.
Sorry, Julie, can I just, and I'm kind of keeping an eye on both the chat group and the Q&A, and we'll get to everybody's questions, I'm sure. Julie will corral us just to answer questions just now. But I just want to add, because the one thing, whenever we have these sessions, or we have our peer group discussions, or even in the IoDSA training sessions, the one thing that I find quite remarkable is everybody always points fingers out there. And my mother always used to tell me when I was growing up, be careful of who you point your finger at, because there are 3 fingers pointing at yourself. And so And I don't know if we're at liberty to share at some point, Julie, but we've got at the IoDSA this corporate governance blueprint, Stefanie. You can have a look at it, which very clearly, if you were to juxtapose it to South Africa Incorporated, very clearly indicates who the shareholders and stakeholders would then be of South Africa Incorporated, and it is fundamentally the citizens. So we keep pointing fingers at the government, we keep pointing fingers at boards of companies, of organizations, whether it be public or private sector. But we must understand, and of course it's complex, it's nuanced, and it's layered. So I'm not suggesting that any of this is a quick fix. But what I'd like to get to the point of, at some point, and maybe before I die, is that this discussion will become a lot more mature, in that we stop blaming out there and we start talking about how we can contribute to doing better, how we can not just hold ourselves accountable, our families accountable, our communities accountable, the places that we inhabit as both professionals and personal. How can we up our game, and how can we ensure that the narrative, the dominant discourse is one of, no, you can't do that? Because, and the example I always use is, we pontificate in these sessions about, you know, what the law says and what King says, and so how does this all go wrong? You know, I don't know, I wasn't there. It's like nobody ever voted for the Nats now when we talk about it. All those people have just magically disappeared. So it's a case of saying, if you at the William Nicol off-ramp, who is buying the grey market goods there, the Louis Vuitton bags, the Prada shoes, the DVD of Encanto before it even was released in the cinema? Who is that? And who is sitting in the back seat? It's the children. And who is sitting in the next car? It's other people. So the social fabric of South Africa requires all of us to participate in that. And I saw a comment, I think from Osman, about ethics and culture in organizations. Ethics and culture are not driven from the top down by these lofty statements that are put up on the wall in these fancy frames around our values and policies and codes of conduct. They are driven by what is in the hearts and minds of people. And so when we talk about ethics, when we talk about culture, we need to understand and talk more about where our moral compass lies, and that we don't hold everybody out there to a higher standard. But when we're on the road and we are running late for an audit committee or running late for our school, our kids' recital at school, that we very quickly will either offer a can of Coke or offer a $50 to whoever stops us. And I believe that increasingly we're seeing that a lot of people will say, no, thanks. Are you trying to bribe me? But why do we offer it? So there's always the corruptor and the corruptee. And we focus so much on public sector and SOEs and SOCs. What about the private sector? There's a lot happening in that space, which we often don't talk about. So this idea of collaborative leadership, consultative leadership, talking about truly being an effective and ethical corporate or organizational citizen, where we look at who's in our stakeholder ecosystem and we think beyond not just profit or delivery on a government-driven mandate, but we think about our communities in the narrowest and broadest sense possible. I think that's really important. And before I take your question, Julie, the last thing I want to say here, and I must say thank you to David Lewis of Corruption Watch, he's now left, but they put this amazing video together and I love it. And every so often I still watch it. It's an animated type video, which explains why corruption should be important to us, why who we appoint to these positions of power. And of course, it was focused on public sector, but I think we can take a lot of lessons out of it from for private sector, of why it should mean something to us. Why should we care? And it breaks it down into the impact. I think, Stefanie, you made the point, the impact on each and every one of our lives. And so I'll try and find it, Julie, and maybe when you send out the recording, you can share it. It is in the public domain anyway. It's a lovely Corruption Watch video. Thanks
you. Thanks, Faye. So you're chatting now about how we must stand up, and if one finger's pointing out, the rest of the fingers are pointing back, and accountability, the responsibility of accountability also sits with us. I'm going to ask you a two-part question, one from two different questions I see here. If the legislation and the regulatory framework is sound in dealing with director misconduct, why are directors not being held accountable? I mean, we are seeing this, but I think more so. And then I'm going to link it into a question on for us who are up and coming, and starting out. How do we start having the standing up conversation, and who do we start it with? And what happens if it falls on unwilling or unhearing ears? Where do we start with that? It's all about accountability. Why are we not seeing more of it? And what do we do if we want to stand up and hold people accountable? Where do we start? Absolutely.
So I'm going to start first with something, Stefanie, because I'd like to hear your input on this question as well. But in the Tolmay judgment in the Mieni matter, Judge Tolmay drew from the law, and I'll read it out. I've actually made a note of it. And it says, it is drawn specifically from the law, but it is in the judgment. It says that directors in this instance will be measured against their conduct in terms of them acting with the degree of care, skill, and diligence that may reasonably be expected of a person carrying out the same function in relation to the company as those carried out by that director, and having the general knowledge, skill, and experience of that director. So inherent in that is the subjective and objective test. Now, objective in that, there is an objective standard of what we can expect from our leaders. And I say leaders because whether it's in a trust, I think Douglas talked about a trust, or whether it is at a board, or whether it is in a public sector or an NPC, etc., school governing bodies, homeowners association, etc. There's an external standard that is the objective test. And that should not be something foreign to us. That is how we should measure ourselves. Over and above, and that's why the Mieni matter is so exemplary in this instance, is the fact that Ms. Mieni had described herself as a self-appointed technical specialist or governance specialist. And so you've got the objective standard, and then you've got another layer, which is if you are a governance specialist, as you say you are, then not only were you appointed according to the objective test, but now there's a subjective layer that is on top of that, which means there is slightly a higher standard which we are going to apply. And we don't unilaterally apply that standard. By your own admission, you're a specialist. So when for our people sitting in on this, many of them want to follow the route of becoming a professional director, or asking the question of, if I am in situ on a board, to Juanita's question, how do I deal with some of these challenges, etc. We need to ask ourselves, why do we want to be a professional director? Why do we want to be a director at all? And ask ourselves some really soul-searching questions, because the answer is really clear in that it is not a fame-seeking exercise. You shouldn't be wanting your name in lights. And secondly, it is not a money-making undertaking. So if you think that you're going to live the high life and your name's going to be everywhere, then you're doing it for the wrong reasons. And eventually, like the truth always comes out, you will be caught out. And so I think why that is important, because when we talk about some of the practical application of this, we'll see that when we talk about who should become a director and how we should appoint that director, and what that process is in terms of interrogating the individual, vetting them, those are all very important. So when we start talking about these standing up conversations, the courageous leadership that we ask for, don't be afraid to stand up and be counted. Don't be afraid to put up your hand. A few people mentioned in the chat box that it's not so simple. And this is why what I do is so important to me, because the theory is all there. The law is clear. The regulations are clear. King is clear. Your board charter, your code of conduct might be clear, but it's not so simple. And we've seen it with the whistleblowers, that sometimes the stakes are so high that we cannot be armchair critics. We cannot sit like players, referees on the sideline, as most of South Africa does with our sports matches, and say, oh, that should have been the call, and oh, that's what you should have done. It is not simple to have these stand-up conversations, especially when you are dealing with challenge. But that doesn't mean you mustn't do anything. So obviously the first thing, and I would like to point everybody to the IoDSA Director Competency Framework. That's why we don't only talk about technical proficiencies or skills. We also talk about behavioral attributes, personal attributes. We talk about interpersonal skills, conflict resolution, mediation. We also talk, you know, it's the things that are unspoken. How do you present at the table? Are you dominant and are you a bully, or are you silent and just passive in a way that a puff adder sits and waits to strike, or just really not really there and engaging? Because those things determine how you navigate board discussions, especially the challenging discussions. And just because you might not be in the chair, and I want to talk about the chairperson later, but because you might not be in the chair doesn't mean that you cannot introduce a different board dynamic, a board energy, and almost introduce and elevate the engagement so that it's not personalized. And yes, both private sector and public sector, I've advised many boards, we've evaluated many boards, where this personalization of topics, of discussions, it's like you might as well be in the sandbox with a whole lot of juveniles rather than at a board of a listed entity or a big SOC that has such a huge balance sheet and a huge footprint in terms of our economy. So we need to hold the mirror up to ourselves, first of all, and ask, why are we there? And if you are going to, especially now that we are holding people more accountable, are you prepared for you being held accountable? Are you prepared to be told that even though you tried to introduce change, that you became part of the problem and not the solution? So specifically to Anita's question, you know that having that courageous conversation and standing up when it's not so simple, the best thing to do is to have a conversation. And this is the nuanced interpersonals. They call it the softer stuff, but I can see it's more of a core element or a core thing that you want to develop. You need to have a discussion with the chairperson first and see if there is an interpersonal conflict or a challenge. If it is about one person or if it is about an organizational process, have the conversation with the chairperson. If the chairperson is not strong, or if the chairperson feels that they don't agree with you and they somehow marginalize you, then you've got to go through a process. And this is where we start talking about being a dissenting director, which is a formal process that you start and you go through. Now, before that process, you should feel comfortable enough and have enough courage that you are able to, in the absence of support from the chairperson, actually call for the topic to be put back on the agenda, write to the entire board and raise the points that you are not feeling comfortable with, and then ask for a discussion to be had, and where it is not being discussed in sufficient depth for you. If you find you are the lone voice, then you need to talk to either the lead independent director, or you need to talk to the chairperson of either the audit committee or the social and ethics committee, because they should be independent to the organization completely. If you're still not getting any traction, you need to, depending on whether you're in a private sector or public sector organization, and without breaching your duty of confidentiality, you need to escalate it to either the shareholders or some other, if there's a regulatory authority. SIPC has a lot of teeth, even though a lot of our directors don't know it. You've got the companies tribunal, etc. You've got a lot of things you can do. but it needs to be handled in a manner where you are clear about how you're engaging the issue. So it doesn't need to also be necessarily something that needs to be acrimoniously dealt with at the boardroom table. There's no harm in leveraging informal and unofficial channels as long as it's not inappropriately done. So I hope, I mean, for the purposes of this panel, I hope that I've answered your questions, Julie and Juanita.
Thanks, Faye. Stefanie, would you like to add anything here?
No, I just and addresses someone's question in the questions and answer. I think, you know, I agree. There's always two parties. When you think about corruption, people tend to say corruption extremely easy. It's one of the more difficult crimes to prove, but there's always two parties. And I like to use the analogy of you know, drug abuse. If, you know, people selling drugs, there needs to be a buyer. If you can't sell drugs to yourself. So if the buyers are taken out of the equation, drug, you know, the drug lords will not have a business, because who are they going to sell it to? And the same with corruption. So it adds to Faye's point, is that, you know, there can't be corruption if we have the moral courage to say no. And that's why I think, you know, slowly but surely, civil society that stands up and we say, no, it's painful. It is going to be painful. And you have to have the moral courage to take the pain that comes with it. Yes, there are, you know, there's gatekeepers. I saw someone said about gate. Yes, that's a reality. But if we are persistent in our moral courage, we will get there. I cannot believe that if you are not persistent, that, you know, as a moral, courageous person, that you will not get out on top. That is, it just has to work like that. And if it doesn't, we will make it work like that. It has to be. You know, one has to remember that if you sit on a board and you need that moral courage, you are not held accountable as a collective. You are held accountable as a collective, but also as an individual. And that goes to the question about why did we tackle Dudu and not the rest of the board? Now, the answer is, we are not saying that the rest of the board members were not supposed to be held accountable, but we are an active civil activist organization. We need to choose our battles. And seeing that she is the chairperson, that is why we concentrated on the chairperson. It could have been just as well be someone else. In this instance, it was Ms. Mieni. And then secondly, some of the examples, if you go look at the facts, for example, the Airbus deal and the deal with Emirates, her hand was, you know, we could show that she as the individual was responsible for some of that contraventions. But ultimately, you know, if all the board members could have been held accountable, yes, agree with you wholeheartedly. But that doesn't mean that she should not be held accountable for her actions. So the next time you want to keep quiet, or, you know, think it's not, just think that, you know, it's your moral courage. We tend to concentrate on accountability. We tend to, yes, you are guilty of corruption or fraud or whatever, and yes, you are a delinquent director, but there's a lot to say for ethical behavior and moral courage. And I think that is maybe the biggest sort of public discourse that we need to start having. It's not about whether you are guilty. We've heard this, you know, you are innocent until proven guilty. Sorry to say that right in terms of our constitution only kicks in if you are an accused person. So if you are not before a criminal court of law, it is about what is ethical and what is moral behavior, and that you don't need to be a criminal to be, you know, to have committed unethical behavior, and that we need to support that, and we need to support each other. You know, it is about the collective. So yeah, that's my 10 cents.
Thanks, Stefanie. And this is sort of, you've touched on it now when you mentioned that Dudu Mieni didn't work in isolation. And I know a lot of our focus here has been what's going wrong in SOEs, and the private sector corruption happens there. There are also delinquent directors there. And, you know, a lot of these organizations don't work without private sector lawyers and auditors. So it's not exclusively ring-fenced to SOEs. But two questions that have come in that are similar, or comments and questions that came in, is going to touch on what you just mentioned now about Dudu Myeni and the rest of her board members. People are saying that it's no problem with them being held accountable as the NED, well, the chairperson of that particular entity. But their concern is, why hold her accountable why was she the only person held accountable? And why not have, this person says, I'm sure she did not have the powers to overrule all the directors. And in the comment that came through, it says, the failure of authorities to effect accountability on other directors who allegedly contributed to misconduct. For instance, nothing has been done by government on allegations against the other directors of SAA who assisted or worked with Ms. Myeni. Lack of accountability is putting directors in a bad light. Is there anything you would like to share on that, or explain with us? Someone's asked us to explain why it was only Dudu Myeni that
that was hold to account. We got that question a lot at the time as well. Now, it was firstly practical. It's just you know, resource constraints. When we decide to litigate, it is not something we do easily. Because we have supporters, and we need to account to our supporters. And this case specifically, you know, it cost us an enormous amount of our supporters' money. So it was just practical in that sense. I do agree that all of them should be held accountable, and if we could get more support and more supporters, it might have been possible for us to hold all of them to account. But just remember that ultimately it was not our responsibility. We just took the responsibility on behalf of, I think, so many other, not just our supporters, you know, South Africans that saw what was happening at SAA, and we took the plunge and said, you know what, this is worth it. And in terms of our law, I think it also clarified a few things. And I think it proved that, you know, if government fails to hold to account, civil society have the power to show that then we will do it. And then secondly, going into detail, for example, the Emirates deal. Now, the Emirates deal was supposed to really bring in an enormous amount of money for SAA. What it meant was that it is a coach sharing deal. In other words, SAA could buy sort of seats from Emirates. So, and they could then sell that to their customers at, you know, increased prices. So they could make money. I think, if I'm not mistaken, and from our papers, this deal was supposed to bring in close to $100 million US dollars to SAA. And that MOU was back and forth. The MOU, it was only an MOU, so it was not like legally binding like a contract. It was only supposed to start negotiations. It was supposed to show good faith to Emirates, who is one of the biggest airlines, and because SAA was constrained in the planes that they could use, their long distance, you know, what they could offer their clients was limited. So this increased their footprint indirectly, and also would increase their income. But you know, and although this was not supposed to go to the board, it was a operational sort of thing. The operations team did decide to discuss it with the board. It was back and forth. There was, at some point, the chairperson, Ms. Myeni, wanted to meet with Emirates, which was also not really something that ordinarily happened, but she was indulged. She cancelled 2 or 3 meetings. Then this MOU was supposedly supposed to be signed at this, it was an international event, a lot of media, and Ms. Myeni phoned and said, the president said, don't sign the deal. to a huge embarrassment, not just for the operations team, but for South Africa. We lost that deal. And I think part of the reason why SAA today is basically non-functional and cost us an enormous amount of money out of the fiscus was because of that deal. It was really embarrassing for South Africa. And that was directly linked to actions of the chairperson. I mean, I can go into the Airbus, but the Airbus deal also, you could relate directly to actions by the chairperson and other people, but definitely related. I mean, she, in the Airbus deal, she was firstly also in trouble with SIPSI because she lied and she got a compliance notice, and then she tried to, after she was given a what do you call it, a compliance certificate, she wanted to take that on review. The chairperson, the person herself, lied about the Airbus deal. So there was in the merits of the cases, there was enough merit to say, but go after the chairperson. But let's not forget that we are definitely saying that there was a lot of the board members that we could have gone against. And the Airbus and Emirates are not the only sort of complaints that there was, but it becomes a big case. And you get lost in all the details. So we had to make some hard choices, and we stand behind our choices, but we do not minimize for 1 minute the fact that not just Ms. Mieni were guilty of some contraventions of the PFMA and some of the shenanigans that went on at SAA. I hope that sort of answers the question. I understand that people, why did we single out? I get the question, why did we single out the woman on a board? Because we do need more representation on boards. But it is less about, you're a woman. It's less about who you are, it's about your actions. And we could, in this instance, prove that your actions were not above board and that you are a delinquent director.
Thanks, Stefanie. We're looking now at what is and what has gone. If we look forward, what role, if any, should civil society play in the appointment of directors of SOEs? Stefanie?
Sure. Very important, I think, and again, I want to make reference to the Zondo report, because we should also, yes, people should be held accountable, and hopefully we will, some people will be in orange overalls because they committed crimes and they caused an enormous amount of damage. But we need to look at reform. We need to look at how can we assist in making sure that this doesn't happen again. So firstly, I think it's about education, and I think it is about, you have the moral courage to stand up. So and we discussed that. But I think civil society having, sitting on boards, that, and especially, and the reason why SOEs, we are so passionate about SOEs is purely because of our mandate. So please, because we concentrate on, SOEs and so forth, doesn't mean that the private sector is not guilty and that reform is not needed in the private sector. And in fact, in some instances, you have private and SOEs doing business, and that both parties are guilty. Don't get me wrong. But that we need civil society on SOEs, civil society that can, that can have oversight over who is appointed. Maybe have a civil society member on these boards to make sure that everything is above board, and then transparency. I mean, what I find extremely interesting, and maybe we can have a discussion on this because I would love to hear what Faye is saying, is that part of what is expected of boards is confidentiality. But then if you sit on an SOE, I want to sort of challenge that. Why is that confidential? because it needs to be transparent. I think what we also struggle with is this idea of transparency. You know, we have PIA, we have a constitutional right to information, but if I can tell you how, as a civil activist organization, we struggle to get information, I do not know how people, you know, just normal citizens, how do they get information? So there again is for me, it's actually a contradiction, is that SOE boards should be transparent, but we do expect confidentiality from board members. So how do we weigh that out? But be that as it may, maybe we have time to discuss that, is that maybe also have less political interference, because it's normally, doesn't matter who advises the minister, it's the minister that appoints. But maybe looking at the recommendations that Zono have is to have, for example, this Chapter 9 institution that combats corruption, that looks after combating corruption and how we can eradicate that, but also to have, you know, some committee or something that oversees appointments, because unfortunately, what we've seen, and if you go look at what went wrong, is that appointments were a big problem, because by putting certain people in key positions, and not just boards, management as well, you know, they were allowed to get away with an enormous amount of irregular activities. So again, you get back to, you know, there's nothing wrong with legislation. It's the people that uses it that that creates a problem. Is to just make sure that we have the required expertise, that we the qualifications and so forth. And you know what? It's this idea, this concept of professionalizing the public sector. So if you consider SOE boards to be part of the public sector, is to, you know, professional. Let's be professionals. Let's create, again, this environment where people want to be part of, for example, an SOE because they can do good work. And that we push out the people that is corrupt, and, as you know, have the moral courage to stand together and you know, create you know, just a different environment to work in. There, I agree wholeheartedly. It's up to us. I do think I don't have it quite correct, but I believe that's my version. If good people stay quiet, bad things happen. So we have a duty and responsibility to speak out and effect positive change. It's up to us, no one else.
Hey, is there something you wanted to add? I thought you looked like you wanted to jump in there.
I do. You know, and picking up on some of the comments and everything and trying to weave them all together. And again, just to remind everyone to put your questions in the Q&A box, because if it's in the chat box, we're just going to think they're general comments adding to the discussion. But when it comes to you know, when good people stand idly by, bad things happen. And this isn't now post Zondo or SAA matter. This is time immemorial, okay? And we've got many global as well as national catastrophes and tragedies to, you know, even if we think about those 21 children who died recently, you know, those kinds of things happen when something goes wrong in the system. And so who do we hold accountable? And how does something like that happen to begin with? So we do need to take it back to being practical. And there are just two general points I want to make before I go to some answering of some points that were raised. The one thing is that, and I agree with Doris, there's always, and it happens in these panels and in these sessions, is that everybody makes these very broad sweeping statements and they're not specific. And so that talks to the perspective, it talks to perception, And it talks to, again, this belief that Ms. Mieni was the only guilty one, so she was the only one taken to court. And it doesn't, for me, it reflects, again, a great deal, and I say this with respect, but it reflects a great deal of ignorance. And ignorance in that our leadership, our participants, our directors get their facts from ENCA, News 24, Business Day, or from any of their social media tweets, etc. And I always say, and especially Stefanie, I want to publicly thank you guys for giving me the material for my SAA diligence and delinquency directors program, is that before you start making these broad sweeping statements and being opinionated about anything, go to source. So I can probably count on one hand any of the delegates in my programs that I've run who have actually gone to read not what some journalist says about, not what Faye says about, but goes to source and reads the court documentation itself. Because then the questions that come up against why only Ms. Mieni, was she the only one that was guilty, would have been answered. The thoughts around, but couldn't Nico and the executives have done more? And the answer is yes, but, because there are practical considerations there. And so for me, that going to source and understanding what the facts really are is critical. Because then you can say, from an informed perspective, what should we be doing differently now to avoid a recurrence of these things? And bearing in mind that we have only got the luxury now of discussing how do we avoid the recurrence of it, because things are being brought to the light. So us, Simo is online as well, and I can see he's poking the bear as usual in the chat channel. We who work in this space, this is not news for us. I mean, we've seen it decades ago already, but it's coming more into the light in terms of the public psyche. And so we now can put the discussion front and center of how do we avoid this recurring. The second one, and it's to Doris's point, and without breaching any confidentiality, I know Doris and I share a sentiment when it comes to there are good people out there doing good things. And often when we come to these broad sweeping statements and we come to these very, kind of dinner table over the braai fire opinions, then we forget that there are many good people in the system. We forget and we overlook that many people are fighting the good fight. When we talk about public sector, we are so quick to dismiss, and public sector is not homogeneous. There are many different public sector entities and organizations that do run well. There are many civil servants that do a good job and care about delivering in terms of the Bartopele principles. And there's another client online as well that I see that have run the gauntlet of going and taking the minister to court, for example, and fighting the good fight. So when people ask, what can we do when we're being victimized and when there's somebody unethical in, sure, we can't turn these panels into dialogues in terms of specific examples, but reach out to the IoDSA if you need a mentor or if you need some specific advisory work, technical advisory stuff on your specific matter. But be careful as leaders that we are not too quick to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The topic that I'd like us to elevate the discussion to is what is wrong with our ecosystem. And Simo and I have many had many discussions about this, because it's not just the individuals that must be scapegoated and sacrificed, but we had to also have a Mieni matter to kind of explode this. And for me, the value in the Mieni matter wasn't so much the litigation, but was in the Tolme judgment, because what Judge Tolme and the way she wrote it makes it a lot more accessible to maybe the lay person, maybe the new directors, maybe the inexperienced leaders, in that it brings it all together and says this is the standard by which we must hold directors and leaders accountable. And what we talk about when we talk about that ecosystem, and some scathing comments, Simo, And I don't know if it's Ashley or who about the companies tribunal. I agree. I absolutely agree. I agree about SCOPA. I agree about SACA and any of these regulatory bodies. The auditors, for example, a lot of balls were dropped. A lot of things fell through the cracks. And so whether it's your lines of defense or your watchdog bodies, your oversight bodies, there has been an erosion of that standard of performance that we have expected. The almost kind of open season of breaches of fiduciary duty, governance implosions, collusion, scandal, just people not doing what they were appointed to do, left, right, and center. And so the ecosystem of oversight has failed. But if I can just remind you, if you guys do remember, years and years ago, decades ago, when there was this big energy entity in the States, way before Sarbanes-Oxley and all of that, where already the discussion there wasn't just about the board. It wasn't just about somebody acting because of malicious intent or with a view to defraud or embezzle or hide things. It was also about where were the auditors, where was the exchange oversight body in that instance, where were all the watchdogs? And we are seeing it played out again here. So this shouldn't be seen as new for anyone who operates in this space and who intends on being a leader or a professional director. So we need to stop poking around why people are not being held accountable, and we need to actually look at where we are. And what the good thing is about the Zondo Commission and some of the outcomes, it's taken a long time, it's cost a lot of money, but for the first time, we have in a formal space some sort of information that has been captured, and the manner in which the commission operated in terms of not just hearing its testimony and the investigations means it's a step closer to being packaged for the NPA. And if there are going to be any private prosecutions allowed for OUTA or anybody else, then it's already a step closer in terms of being almost ready for court, if you will, the way those things have been packaged. So we've got this body of knowledge. We need to acknowledge that there has been a gross failure, not just of individuals, but of institutions. We need to then be open to say it's all been a bit of a joke. But at some point, we've got to stop bemoaning our fate, and we've got to look forward. So unless you're getting ready to pack your bag or you're applying to immigrate, you know, it's like when you're getting ready for an election. Don't spend your time on the guys who you know are voting for another party. Don't spend too much time on the guys you know are die-in-the-wool supporters of your party. Spend time with the middle, the ones who you can change their minds. So those who are packing their bags and leaving, good luck, Godspeed, and we wish you well. Be ambassadors for our country. The ones who are going to stay and be naysayers and be so, you know, woe is me and South Africa's all bad, I cannot bear to be in a room with them. I would rather talk about, we are in a mess of the worst sort. It is a quagmire, it is quicksand where there are venomous snakes and spiders all around us. We never know when our heads are going to be chopped off. We treat whistleblowers appallingly. We do not support our peers when they put up their hands and say, I'm in a situation where I want to do good, but I've run out of options. Can somebody help me? Can somebody hear me? I hold us all accountable. What can we do about it? And so when we talk about the companies tribunal, when we talk about holding directors accountable, the reality is that our very lines of defense themselves have imploded or are not working seamlessly, which is why, unfortunately, but thankfully, we have to rely on OUTA. And then everybody says, oh, well, OUTA, what are you doing about it? Corruption Watch, what are you doing about it? Well, there's now 156 people on this panel. Have you ever contributed to OUTA? Because I don't know if any of you know, but they don't have any funding. They rely on the likes of us ordinary folk to actually do what they need to do. So again, it's all this pointing fingers outside. If you want them to take on private prosecutions, and there's no guarantee that you will be allowed to privately prosecute, then we need to contribute and support them. If you want the litigation to happen, if you want to move from a space of where the Zondo report is now and it is surfaced, and understand it was just a state capture commission of inquiry, there is now a long road before it gets into the a litigation space, and an even longer road before it is concluded and people get into orange overalls. So how do we strengthen the bodies that we do have? Or do we say, and this is something Simo and I have talked about, do we say, let's just actually rather almost go scorched earth, because it's so rotten that we cannot build on top of it, because then it's on shifting sands. And maybe let's just clean it up and start from over. And these are the serious conversations that we should be having, rather than just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. This idea of holding directors accountable, Julie, I mean, I don't know if Palmi's online, but let me tell you, we have had this discussion, I think 3 CEOs ago at the IoDSA. Is Stefanie and I are externally regulated, so we have to be mindful of how we conduct ourselves when we go about our business. External regulation as a lawyer, and now obviously that I'm a chartered director and some of the chartered directors online, we are regulated by the IoDSA, but the IoDSA doesn't have the teeth as a statutory regulator. And we are hoping that the powers that be would have heard us, and that the IoDSA is given that support and given those teeth and actually appointed as the regulator of directors, because they've done the most work and have the deepest experience in this space. Because then, as opposed to just us taking people through disciplinary panels and disciplinary processes, and you being blacklisted or no longer allowed to be a member, etc., we need to connect the dots. And how do we hold lawyers, doctors, engineers, etc. accountable? Accountants, architects, auditors. We need to hold directors accountable too, because this is a professionalizing, not just of the public sector, but a professionalizing of boards and of directors. If you do not know how to drive, you haven't gone through your learner's license and your driver's license process, you shouldn't be allowed to be a director. And so I know that the IoDSA has been working with SIPSI, working with some of the other statutory bodies and regulators and authorities, even National Treasury, around actually making sure that at very least, before you are appointed a director, because we know now you just register a company and, you know, wham, bam, shazam, you're a director. My 23-year-old wants to open up his own company and he can be a director tomorrow, you know, that we ask for this basic learning, that you at least go through the Being a Director series, and we encourage everybody online to either look at becoming a certified director or a chartered director. So that doesn't mean that you're not going to do wrong. It doesn't mean that you won't be that you'll be a good doctor or a great lawyer. But it certainly means that if you do wrong, we have a contractual base on which we can come after you. And that is where we start talking about holding people accountable. And I didn't prepare it for today, but I'm happy to put something together where we actually share with our members how many people are being held accountable. They might not all be in orange overalls, but there's a lot of people being held accountable at the moment. And maybe SIPSI is not here, but something, Stefanie, you and I can check is whether she's actually been registered on the database of delinquent directors. Has she? Okay, well, so it's also closing those loops of all of us in this ecosystem. I think that's important. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks, Faye. We've got quite a few questions that are coming in and we'll get to that first, but I wanted to ask Stefanie, I saw you nodding a bit to quite a few things that Faye had mentioned there. Is there anything else you want to add at this point?
I think I couldn't have said it better. There is, you know, I am a firm believer, sometimes it's good to look back to understand the environment in order to make decisions going forward. So you need to understand the problem in order to get to solutions. But we need to be solution driven. Otherwise, you know, it's sitting in your own misery. Complaining is extremely easy. I can sit here and tell you how much money was taken out of the fiscus, how much money we lost, how much, but in order to effect change, we need to be hopeful. And you know, we should, there's a part, let's stop talking. I mean, if I hear one more time, we're going to do something against corruption. Yes, can I see? Can we actually see that you are doing something? Even if it's a small thing. One small thing leads to a bigger thing, leads to an enormous thing. So if everyone in this room today decides to be positive, decides to effect change and be a moral director, your energy will rub off on someone else. And there we create a community of being morally courageous directors. And, you know, when we open our eyes, we're going to be the majority. So it really is about, let's, you know, it's good to talk. It's good to philosophy. You know, there's space for everything, but let's act. So I agree with you wholeheartedly, Faye. Yeah, I mean,
you know, absolutely, Stefanie. And Julie, before we move to the questions, I just want to say that a lot of the comments in the chat that I'm reading as well, again, you know, what can we do? What can we do? That kind of stuff, that tone and timber. And where boards, people who are sitting on boards, there seem to be a lot of them, some of the stuff that they suggest, or to Anita's earlier question, if you've got a problem and you want to raise it and you find that you're really a lone wolf. And Stefanie, bless, Tony Dixon, who was actually my mentor, he was a lone wolf on the SAA board. And if you read the emails that he sent, which are part of the court documents, that he sent to Ms. Mieni, to the SAA board, to the other powers that be DPE and Treasury, etc., you can just fully appreciate how complex these situations are, that it's not so simple. Because Tony was an icon in governance and leadership and directorship. And put it practically, when you see that you are that only person who's, you know, swimming upstream against all these bad apples, it's very difficult. So I don't want us to also create the impression that just follow what the IoDSA says, just follow the law or King 4 and it's all going to go swimmingly. But to answer these points of what do we do when a small company board, I think it was Mark, my mind is being blown at the moment when they say the Companies Act doesn't apply to them, or anyone that says, oh, don't worry, it's not for us. And I've been myself on a body, a statutory body, where they say, oh, King 4 doesn't apply to us. I mean, you know, I'm surprised I haven't keeled over when people say these things. But what I ask of all of you to do here in the session is then don't get personal about it, don't get agitated, and don't get adversarial. Just lower your temperature, lower your voice, exhale, breathe. It's all in body language as well. And then say, but I went on, of course, I'm assuming you would go on, but I went on an IoDSA training, and this is what they said. And I don't know, but maybe it's something we can talk about or discuss, maybe use one of our guidance papers and table it for board discussion, or say, go, you do the work. Stop just throwing it out there on the boardroom table, hoping someone will pick it up. Go read what the law says. Go read what King 4 says, and then you can use that, because that is a fact that cannot be disputed. And you can, it depersonalizes it. And something as simple as joint and several liability, if you start raising the flag to the people at the boardroom table, that they, even if they have been appointed or deployed as a stakeholder constituency representative director, private or public sector, that you are appointed in your personal capacity, it's your house, your car, your reputation, and your livelihood on the line. All of a sudden, everybody sits up quite straight and is willing to listen. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks, Faye, much appreciated. I'm going to just go to some of the questions, because I mean, the idea behind this Ask the Experts is to ask burning questions of members. So I'm going to just jump in with one quick question. Can an independent director sue a rogue board chair for misconduct using the company's resources? So
I'm going to jump in first. Sorry, I might have missed that, so I don't know where it is. But first of all, why would you as an independent director want to take on a rogue director? So because, first of all, you need to establish what a rogue director is. So I'm assuming a rogue director is somebody who has either acted unethically or unlawfully, or in flying in the face of whatever the standard of conduct was. There's been poor performance or has breached his or her fiduciary duties. In that instance, there are very clear processes that boards go through, because you are a member of the board, number one, or that the company goes through and the shareholders can go through. And even now, what the Companies Act has done is it's opened the net very widely to say, if you are an interested party, or if, and that's what, I mean, I don't want to go into the legalese, but where you prove locus, where you have an interest in terms of the outcome of this matter, then you have standing. And so you can raise a concern, you can go to the public protector, etc. But before you as an independent director or an individual director want to go off like John Wayne and, you know, one of the Westerns and, you know, go save everybody using company resources, there's a process that you have to follow. So it should be that the board should look at either rehabilitation, either look at probation, or look at having the director declared delinquent. And again, the paper that I see Cindy has been putting on the link quite a few times, for those of you who might have missed it, go and read the paper, because there's annexures to the paper which actually show you very methodically what those processes are. So yes, you do have options available to you, but just don't go off hearing as an individual director wanting to use company resources, because those are things that need to be handled in a very organized fashion. I hope that answers that.
Thanks, Faye. Stefanie, I'm going to ask you this question. I know we've touched on it a bit already, but I'm just going to see if we've covered all the information we need to cover. Directors do not know how to strike a healthy balance between politics and their duty to stakeholders. What is your opinion on that?
Unfortunately, I do think that, you know, let's not, because sometimes one gives the impression that you generalize. So if you take the majority, I think that it is a problem. The political interference is unfortunately a problem in SOE boards specifically. And I think that led to, you know, the whole state capture era, because the minister can appoint and they are accountable to the minister, you sit with this imbalance. You can sit with this imbalance. And, you know, we don't want to talk politics. By the way, may I interrupt myself? Someone once said it was we were part of a grouping that were talking about, it was just before elections, and it was a grouping, international grouping that came to observe. And then, you know, I started the spiel after as an apolitical, blah, blah, blah. The guy actually said, you know what, you can't say that you are apolitical. You are non-partisan, because we live in a political environment. You can never say you are apolitical, you are non-partisan. So just interesting. Right. But we all know this is not about politics, because I sometimes think, you know, I think I'm too dumb for politics. I studied law. It's, I don't know what, it's a necessary evil. And I sometimes think if the country can be run by civil society and all of that, wouldn't that be lovely? But yeah, that is, you know, one of those things that we can talk for the rest of the day about that. Is it a reality, philosophical, and all of that? Unfortunately, we are faced with political interference because there's an imbalance. Does that mean that we are faced with you know, a problem that we cannot overcome? Absolutely not. We do need change. We do need a political will to change it. I mean, I was, I don't necessarily want to mention political parties, but, you know, one political party said that they're going to the FBI to investigate. And I thought to myself, okay, where were you when we were going through a very bad space with state capture? If you can get the FBI to come and investigate this, couldn't you have, you know, got them to investigate state capture and the fact that an enormous amount of money left our shores. So, you know, a lot of talk and all of that, but we need to find that balance. And there's a lot of answers, and I think, you know, we are currently in Parliament busy with electoral, you know, changing the Electoral Act. And I think Judge Londra also referred to, you know, let's think about electoral reform. And I think it is an important issue one needs to discuss, because if you get electoral reform, you get closer to, again, you know, South Africans, the majority being closer to what government can do for them. I think it will be better, and that we get that balance, you know, again, towards, you know, directors that can take their mandate seriously and talk about what is right and do what is right, and not necessarily to a small group of politicians necessarily. So yeah, unfortunately, but I think if you have the moral courage to stand up, we can also change that.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Stefanie. There's 3 questions.
Can I also just say that you know, it's also about the holding people accountable in terms of the spirit as well as the letter of the law. So the very fact that our watchdog bodies, our oversight bodies have failed is also a symptom of, somebody talked about moral decay, but it is a symptom. We cannot look at all of this in a vacuum. We need to look at where we've come from 30 and more years ago. And again, non-partisan, but look at the way governance of the country and how that tone has been set at the top, which has then cascaded down into governing of our SOEs as well as of our big multinational listed bodies, listed companies, and then going smaller and smaller. So I think we need to talk about that spirit of what we're trying to do, which is why I always like to go back to our constitution. It is aspirational, but it certainly does set the tone that we must work towards.
Thanks. Okay. I've got 2 questions that are similar. It's from the employee's perspective. The one example is a little bit more convoluted, but I will just go with the simpler one. How do you deal with unethical or reckless behavior by a director in a private company where you are not on the board, but in a position where you become aware of it happening? The other question mentions that if the person's is how do you get addressed when you're given, how does that get addressed given that you're an employee and an executive director? So they're talking from the employee's perspective, how would they address misconduct by a board member? Also addressing potential misconduct by an appointed secretary, company secretary. And I think that was also mentioned in the comments quite early on in the session, is the role of the company secretary, and if there's an issue there with the appointed secretary. Faye?
So again, a lot of these types of questions talk to either a lack of governance protocol or processes in situ, or if they are in place, as we know, there's a lot of malicious compliance and tick box approaches going on. So you have these policies being sent out, or these protocol statements being sent out, and people are asked to read them, or I know in some of the bigger entities, you aren't allowed to log on to your laptop unless, or your computer, unless you've ticked something to say you've read it. But I don't know how many people actually read those things. So it talks about awareness raising. That's the first thing. In terms of the actual process here, there should always be, if something is going wrong in an organization, whatever sector, industry, then there should be a process as to which guides you as to how you should handle it. So there should be some kind of, I'm not talking about a complaints box here, but some kind of committee escalation point, or if you see somebody stealing something, or if you find that there's been victimization, if you find that there has been a misallocation of resources, or maybe people are not acting in the best interests of the entity at any level. It shouldn't only be at the level of the chairperson and the board or the executives. So there should be a mechanism in place. So practically, let me say to all of you, that's the first step, is just to find out, in answer to your questions, is go and see whether this thing is in place or not. If it is not in place, then get something like that in place. So if it's not in place and yet the employee finds themselves in that situation, then there has to be, you know, this is a very personal kind of question, a personalized or a specific question. Then you've got to ask the employee or the executive who is an employee, etc., as to where they are in the organization, and if they are in a certain team, who do they trust? And I mean really trust in that organization. And if they don't trust anyone, then you've got other avenues that you can follow. And not that I necessarily suggest it now, because those can be long and unwieldy and might not give you a quick response that you seek, but go to the IoDSA if those people are members, or go to the public protector, etc. If there is somebody that you trust in the organization, then you need to start with that escalation. If you are concerned that you will be victimized or harassed in turn, and we know we don't have ample protection in real terms for whistleblowers, then you need to tread very carefully. And I would then, in that instance, if there are those concerns, Stefanie, I'm going to offer your services here, but reach out to somebody like me or Stefanie or Palmy, or go through Julie. I mean, there are people available, or Sherma. I see Sherma's also looking at that mentorship program thing, to ask about what are the practical ways to go about this. But if you see that something wrong is happening and you do have a process in place, you feel comfortable and courageous enough to stand up and say something about it, then you've got to press the trigger. But let me tell you, like with dissenting directors, before you open the door, before you press the trigger, please have your facts sorted out. Because even where I sit as a chairperson or a lead independent director or a chairperson of one of the statutory board committees, my first response is, have you gone through the internal processes? And if you tell me that you haven't, or you're just dismissive of it, then I will ask why. If you tell me that you are scared and you feel vulnerable and exposed, then I'm happy to have a conversation with you. So also don't feel bad about escalating it. Where the problems come in, even in the absence of a formal protocol or a policy, where the trouble comes in is where the executive director, the CEO, the chairperson are the problems. Then you've got to look at a more formal and structured way of approaching it. And for those people who have asked those questions, I really want to encourage you to reach out to your peers, or reach out to the IoDSA, to some of the mentors, or Vicky's I'm sure here as well, in terms of the advisory services, the Center for Corporate Governance with the IoDSA. Really do. You're not alone. You are not alone. And even if there are no protocols in place, then I ask you to do two things: introduce them if you can, wherever you are in the company, and two, in the absence thereof, you still have some mechanisms that you can leverage. I hope that helps. It's difficult to have very kind of dialogue-based responses in some of these questions, Julie.
Thanks, Faye. I appreciate that. I also wanted to ask you, sometimes even the most learned of colleagues, when it comes to reading some legislation and some guidance on corporate governance or whatever, there's a lot of legalese and quite convoluted language within legislation. And one of the earlier questions we had was, is the legalese and potentially formal legal English a barrier to directors that use English as a second or third language? And if it is, whose responsibility is it to ensure that the various pieces of legislation and guidance are properly understood by all directors in terms of implementation and consequences? Faye, do you have any?
So I just want to, this is quite a nuanced question, and I just want to make sure that we don't, get any fur flying. So this isn't about, South Africa and all its official languages, but legislation is required to be, there's a clear guideline, and I think even a law around how we use or produce and disseminate our laws using all the different types of languages. Okay, so there's that. So let's not assume that the resources are not available in one's mother tongue. That's the first thing. The second thing, I don't want to get into a debate about it, but as we now stand, English is the medium that is used professionally. So in boards, etc., it is the medium that is used. Like in court, it is also the medium, but you have interpreters, etc. So if you find that there is somebody who maybe is a mother tongue speaking, and it's not just about the South African languages, you could find you have an international director who maybe grapples with English. Or let's just say it's a Zulu heavy or an Afrikaans heavy board and people default into their mother tongue. Then it is up to the company to make sure that the discussion is clearly understood. But again, the default should be that English, certainly the way we currently operate globally as well, that English is the language of business, as it were. As to the question around, and Juanita, I think, asked that question, around whose responsibility is it to understand what the director's requirements are, the standard of conduct, and what the board processes, how they are governed and regulated. And I see in the chat box, some people were laughing at the annual appraisal and evaluation, which I think is hugely underestimated, would be the company secretary and the chairperson. It is their responsibility as the almost head guideline or head guide and head caretaker, if you were, of what happens at board level. So the board dynamics, how the board itself functions, those are the two people who have that in their roles and responsibilities. And they then have to make sure that everybody understands what is going on, which is why the chairperson is such a key position. And we haven't talked too much about that, unfortunately. But whether you understand what's going on, also taking people through, and that's why induction is so important, and your continuing professional development program is so important. Don't assume that everybody understands everything, and don't assume that everybody on the board understands it in the same way. And that's why when we talk about the duties of a director, we add in acting for proper and common purpose. So what you understand by integrity might be different to what I understand by integrity. And so it is up to the board chairperson to surface those things. And in terms of your continuing professional development program, we're suggesting, because adult learning is easier through drip feeding, we're suggesting that on a board, you just tack on at every board meeting, half an hour to talk about something. You can have a talking head in, a technical specialist to coming in. You share articles for discussion points. You may be on your website, password protected, etc. Create a little chat group. Create even a WhatsApp group for your board, not for decisions or resolutions or anything, but just to start the inculcating that ease of flow between board members, and so that they can glue and bond around some critical topics and items.
Thanks, Faye. What recourse do ethical directors have when they are victimized and sidelined by unethical directors to a point of resigning and leaving the organization? Faye?
Can I take this? Yeah. Tebogo, my heart breaks for anyone who finds themselves in this situation, simply because from personal experience, and I know from a lot of my colleagues, I think we were even on our own chat group, somebody, posed that as having had that challenge recently and having then decided to leave the board. It's almost that case of the dissenting director, and maybe Cindy can post the paper that we did on dissenting directors, because there's a process that you follow. At the end of the day, though, if you have gone through that formal process, have jumped through all the loops or hurdles or whatever, and you find that you're not winning, that becomes a very personal decision, because it's not everybody is wired to be a whistleblower. Not everybody is able to truly have the courage of their principles and stand up and take the risk of being shut down or being killed, for example. The question in this instance comes to also, when you are appointed, that you are beholden to doing the right thing because it is the right thing to do, and you're not beholden to your meeting allowance. Because all of a sudden, when you are dependent on the money coming in, you'll think 3 times before you put up your hand and you start to rock the boat, because you might then be tossed off the board simply because everyone thinks you're just contrary and you're a difficult director. But in this instance, if you see something being done that is unethical and potentially unlawful, you as a director actually not just have a moral responsibility, you don't just have a governance responsibility, but I believe you have a legal responsibility. And the legislation there that I point to is your PRECA, which is your Prevention and Combating of Corruption Activities Act, because now, in keeping with that throwing the net wide, we're saying that if you knew, or here's the kicker, if you should have known, then you will be held liable yourself. So even if you merely went on your way and you said, oh no, business judgment rule, I didn't know. Well, hello, you should have known, simply by virtue of you being a director. And what did you do about it? And that response goes to all the other questions or comments that were made in the chat box, the chat channel, because what did you do? You cannot just keep throwing mud. What did you do about it? And in this instance, you do have to stand up and do something about it, or you have to resign and leave. But you cannot stay because it's majority rule. It's the majority of the decision. If you stay, you will be held accountable, jointly and severally liable by the decision of the majority. But if you see something unethical, there are processes. Again, read the dissenting director paper, read the misconduct paper. We take you through what some of the steps are that you can do to report unethical behavior. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks, Faye. For those watching the chat, there's quite a few things that we post in we've posted the dissenting director paper, a webinar that we hosted on that paper. There is a course, Sherma's posted information on a whistleblowing course that was mentioned higher up in the comments. And yeah, so there are a few things that the IoD is trying to help provide to increase the knowledge, increase the capabilities of people to deal with these issues. There's quite a lot of information available on the website, so please take a look. Stefanie, is there anything else you would like to add on that at that point? I often see you nodding, and it doesn't necessarily mean you have anything else to add, but I don't want to leave you out.
I just want to add, whistleblowing is also a hot topic in South Africa. So unfortunately, we're not there yet. Everybody's talking about it, and we need to find a solution where whistleblowers can blow the whistle safely. But what we've realized, whistleblowing is actually extremely complex because you have different types of whistleblowers. And, you know, when I was still at the NPA, I know that there was a witness protection program. There you're talking about, you know, someone being a whistleblower against a gang that, you know, fears for their life. There are whistleblowers out there that, you know, would want security, people looking after them. And we often forget there's an emotional part to whistleblow. You know, you're being isolated. I think Cynthia Stimple can really talk to, you know, what she went through when she blew the whistle, the fact that people struggle thereafter because people close ranks, can't get a job. So what does that say for that moral courage and you know, blowing the whistle? So it is, I think I've attended quite a few seminars on whistleblowing. All I can say, and let me leave this when it comes to whistleblowing, we need ideas, and we need people to advocate for better legislation, and, you know, again, that action in terms of turning the ship around and making it possible for whistleblowers to actually do what is right, because that is what we want.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Stefanie. There's a question here about voluntary boards. One of the challenges I've encountered is on a voluntary board where the directors feel that because they volunteer, they do not have to be held accountable, which I think is the biggest mistake. Stefanie, what's your views on that?
if you're a director, whether you, and funny enough, I was actually thinking about it before the New Companies Act, there was a problem with, if you're a non-executive, basically, that you can escape accountability because, what I think the Company Act wanted to address is that, people say, I attend board meetings 4 times, I didn't know, and all of that. Now there is no difference between an executive and non-executive. I mean, contractually, an executive, because you are an employee, there's other rules and legislation that also is applicable to you. But whether you're voluntary or whatever, directors, and let's talk about the ideal. And as a director, I take my position seriously. There's a reason why, you are a director, you have responsibilities, and a director is a director, whether you are there volunteer. In fact, if you volunteer, you put up your hand to be, courageous and put your foot down and have certain obligations and dealing with decisions in terms of, all the rules, legislation, tips and whatever there is out there. So yeah, to me, there's no, and I actually want to say, as a director, we should be part of a grouping that is standing together and giving support to one another. And maybe that is something we also need to discuss in being moral correct. I think what we tend to see, and this is with the collapse of local government, is that we tend to we pull inwards, and, as long as I'm safe where I am, as long as I have water, as long as I have electricity and I have solar and whatever, we don't look outwards. And I think we need to start supporting one another again and take the plunge. I mean, the pain will be there. It's not going to be easy, but the more we do it, and find solace in one another, I think that's one of the things that I want to leave with people, is that they are, you have courage in numbers, and that as directors stand together and support one another, and that the people that are, the unethical directors, if the ethical directors are in the majority, then they are the, then their job is on the line, their directorship is on the line, and not yours. But that will only come when we realize that we need to stand together.
Thanks, Stefanie. Now, you know what they say, time flies when you're having fun. And we seem to be, time has flown. We've got 3 minutes left, and I'm sorry if we haven't got to all your questions. First, before everyone leaves, I'm going to show a slide after the final comments. I'd really love your feedback on the session. It's a QR code, so pick up your cell phones and scan the QR code and give us your feedback, please. And I'm going to do this while asking if there's any final comments from Faye and Stefanie on this matter. Faye, Stefanie?
I just want to cluster a few things just before I go. The first is this idea that there is a difference between non-executive and executive directors, and to make the point that any of the categorizations or separations do not exist in law. They are in practice. So a director is a director is a director. Whether you get paid or not, whether you're an executive or non-executive, the standard is the same. So hopefully that kind of answers that. So even if you're an executive director, you're wearing 2 hats. You've got 2 levels of a relationship with the organization, the employment relationship as well as the director relationship. And obviously there is law and there are standards that govern both. So that's the one thing. Just in terms of where we locate ourselves internationally, we are actually a leading light in the governance space. The King Codes, and I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more from ANSI through the rest of the year, but the King Codes are taken as an internationally benchmarked standard that is actually replicated in other countries, and obviously massaged to be more relevant there. But we certainly, and if you're looking at where we're looking at merging standardization bodies, you're looking at the new buzzword, which is ESG, which I don't want to talk about today, but all of those things. So we definitely do stand head and shoulders above the norm. As to whether our accountability stats are as good, I think we're all struggling, but we must also be mindful that we're not the worst, okay? Not that that should be a measure of anything. And then my final point, Julie, is just some practical tips for you is the revisit your selection, nomination, and appointment process, because that's how you make sure you don't get the bad eggs, okay? If it is a robust process, there must be clear criteria for who your board members are, and go and look at the competency framework, the IoDSA Director Competency Framework, and look at the due diligence paper that we've also issued. Specifically for public sector boards or even the private sector boards that have a constituency or stakeholder element to it, where you might want civil society representatives or trade union representatives sitting on the board, you don't have to settle for just anyone. You can give guidance as the chairperson or the company secretary or the company itself as to the type or the caliber of individual that comes from that sector. And again, I think it is really important. A lot of you have agreed that we do professionalize this, and we do have a regulatory body. I vote the IoDSA, of course, and that we do ensure that people have been through some kind of training before they're appointed. That appointment letter or appointment agreement, I think most of you must go back and look at it for yourself and for your companies or organizations, because if they exist, they're really very poorly drafted for the ones that I've seen. So those need to be strengthened. And especially there's usually a clause missing that talks about the clawback, that says if you're going to breach your duty or not perform well, that we're going to come after you for your fees that you've already taken. Continuing professional development, how people conduct themselves in this VUCA world, on social media, etc. All of that adds to the standards of conduct. And I think we've done some work on that, if I remember correctly. We haven't talked about evaluation and appraisal, and we can pick it up another time. And then, of course, coaching and mentorship. I want to encourage everyone on this group to actually set up, even 3, 5, 6 people, set up your own little peer groups. You know, the chartered, well, not chartered directors, but maybe some of our technical facilitators and advisors, we have a group where you can bounce things off each other, and you have a safe space so that you really know that you are not alone. Julie, like Stefanie said at the outset, we can talk forever around this, but we need to start getting more practical. My final takeaway or thought is, what more can you do? Stand up and be counted, and what can you do first and foremost? Thank you.
Stefanie, your last thoughts before we close out?
Be the change that you want to see. Be a civil activist. I want to be a little bit sort of selfish in the sense that, support, support OUTA, the organization undoing tax abuse. But if you don't, support civil activism and become involved. If you stay on the outskirts, you will not see the change. Again, be the change that you want to see. And, from my point of view, thank you for webinars like this. I found your document very informative. I mean, it really just drills down and gives you the basics without, sometimes law can be difficult to explain to someone. So I was very impressed with your document. Congratulations. And, thank you for inviting, for example, OUTA, 2 sessions like this. We are a passionate bunch of people at OUTA. I'm so proud and I'm inspired by the people that work at OUTA, but also, by our supporters, but inspired by, everyone in this session that takes their job seriously. And with directors like this, we will definitely create that environment we want to see. So thank you. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Faye. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
So my final thank you to the advocates, Faye and Stefanie. Thank you very much for joining us and being part of our panel. it's a pity our third advocate couldn't join us, but we've still done well and we've answered. I'm apologizing already to two of our panelists who've got their hands up. We have unfortunately run out of time. We are going to now close down the session, and I thank you all for joining us. I wish you good luck with the load shedding schedule ahead. Stage 6, we'll make the most of it. And when you are tempted to complain about load shedding, think about what was said today. What can you do to positively change things? What can you put your efforts behind to make a difference versus sitting in the dark with your candle? And I will enjoy speaking to you all again at our next session next month, the 27th, and we will be in contact soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.